You're listening to a podcast from thespoilist.com. Cyberspace, the new frontier. These are the voyages of the podcast First Contact. Its mission? To explore every episode of Star Trek The Next Generation. To seek out new viewers and have new conversations. To boldly view what many have viewed before. Welcome once again to First Contact, the Star Trek The Next Generation intro cast. I'm Andrew.
I'm James.
And I'm Alex.
James and I are guiding Alex, the newcomer to Star Trek The Next Generation, through the episodes of that show. This time we are looking at The Battle. That was directed by Rob Bowman from a teleplay by Herbert Wright based on a story by Larry Forrester. It aired on the week of November 16th, 1987, as if you care. James, what happens in this episode?
The Ferengi present Picard with his old ship, the Constellation-class USS Stargazer, lost after a battle with a mysterious enemy. Logs reveal that Picard attacked the alien vessel unprovoked, and since the arrival of the ship, he appears to be unravelling. Could the captain be involved in a cover-up, or is this a Ferengi idea of revenge? It's probably the revenge thing.
Yes, the battle, the return of Picard's old ship. We've had a rough run of episodes over the last couple, I would say. Did you find this to be an improvement?
I thought better, but still room for substantial improvement. I didn't hate it. I think that's, I think that's a good sign to start with. No, I thought it had good ideas. The execution was much better than we've had in the last couple. As I say, still things that could be improved on, but it feels like it's back on course again now, even if some of the ideas are things that we've already touched upon this series.
It's the return of the Ferengi, previously seen in The Last Outpost. Did you think this was a better vehicle for them than that episode?
Oh, absolutely. They aren't anywhere near as annoying, frankly. They've gone from being these sort of irritating imp characters to more cunning, and it's all based around their deception. That's a much smarter move than what was presented before, which just wasn't very good, to be honest. Or at least, certainly not for an introduction. If this had been the introduction to the Ferengi, that would have been much better.
I agree, and in terms of character, very interesting they are bringing in something that is relevant to one of the crew of the Enterprise. I think that, as a story vehicle, is a lot more interesting than the random planets that we've had up to now.
Well, it's nice to go into Picard's history, get a bit more backstory on him, really. And we know he's this great hero, and he's kind of a tactical genius, really, coming up with the Picard maneuver.
That sounds dodgy.
No, you're thinking of the Riker maneuver. That's the dodgy one. But with the Ferengi, it couldn't be their first episode, because you need to have established that they're all about profit. And I mean, I guess you could add a bit more dialogue to establish this, but the fact that they're all about profit and they're basically ultra capitalists, it makes you think, well, why are they giving away this ship? So you do sort of need to have that little bit of backstory from the previous episode with the Ferengi.
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, it's nothing that you couldn't have incorporated in somehow, I don't think, but it's purely down to the fact that they're just done better here. If they'd been done like this in the previous episode, there wouldn't have been a problem, to be honest with you.
I mean, the only thing I really had against them in the previous episode was that they were jumping up and down for no reason.
Yeah, that is a large part of it.
Deanna Troi senses that there's an ulterior motive with the Ferengi.
No, really?
I'm so glad she's there, because without her insight, the crew would be floundering. I hope they have an empath on every one of the ships, because without her, to state the obvious, then there's really very little action anyone can take with any certainty. Clunky character moments aside, there are some really nice ones in this episode, like when Picard says it's like going back to the house you grew up in, but nobody's home. I thought that was quite a nice moment and quite poetic from the captain.
Yes, and leaving him to sort of wander the ship more or less on his own. You are playing into elements, because as you said, we haven't had a lot on the character, so to have some of his history is good. Sort of a metaphor for the loneliness of command, I suppose you could say. And of course that builds to the ending with him hallucinating, so that we get an image of what happened there before. It's a shame that we've had the crew hallucinating just a few episodes ago, because that takes the sting out the tail a little bit. But if you could ignore that makes this episode a lot better.
And similar to the hallucinations, we've also had Picard acting out of character in Lonely Among Us not so long ago as well.
And we've also had an episode with the crew talking to the Ferengi on screen for an awful lot of the runtime. So it kind of feels like we're doing bits of several episodes that have gone before, just better.
The one thing that annoys me about the Ferengi on the screen is, do they just go and stand in front of a white wall before they talk to people? Why are they not on the bridge? It seems very strange. They've got this massive screen and you filled most of it with white space.
Incidentally, when we're talking about Ferengi phone calls, as a phrase, since when has the first officer to first officer been a thing?
Well, that's clearly, they've got a bond about being second in command for some reason.
We're deceiving you all the way, but there's this bond between first officers, so I'll tell you our secret plot. That doesn't make any sense.
Well, I mean, the other two Ferengi didn't know that they were deceiving Picard and the rest of the ship, did they?
They were aware that something was wrong, I think. Just not to what extent. I mean, it's all one big Trojan horse manoeuvre, isn't it, basically? So they're aware that's going on, they're just not aware of the insanity of their leader.
I mean, it is very much a Trojan horse story, and of that plot, as it begins, the Ferengi have summoned the Enterprise, and they've been waiting for 3 days. 3 days for them to say anything. Could they not have just, waited a week before they contact the Enterprise? It's all very well, to be going on about building intrigue and a mystery, but, I think they might get a bit bored. I mean, how much holodeck sex can you really have?
I never really got an explanation as to why they've been waiting for 3 days.
I guess it was so they could power up the Stargazer and bring it to Picard, but there was no real story need for that, or really a script need. It was just, I suppose, to establish that Captain Picard has a headache.
How do we feel, incidentally, about the idea that headaches have been eliminated in the future? Really?
It's absurd, isn't it?
Yeah, there's no headaches, there's no colds, there's still blind people.
Do you know what a headache is? Of course I know, but I don't often suffer from them. Oh, well, good for you.
We have the Ferengi once again mentioning how appalled they are that women are dressed.
I believe that J.J. Abrams has expressed similar sentiment with his new film.
In terms of characters, Will Wheaton regards this episode as the moment that everybody decided that they hated Wesley because he went from a slightly precocious teen to just being an absolute obnoxious moron.
Oh, no, I don't know about that. No. He's been an annoying prick the whole way through. It's just here he's got quite a crappy jumper.
I do think it is quite pronounced here. For example, his coming onto the bridge to say, "This is about to happen, by the way," just before it does, as opposed to sending a message. If any other officer does that, and of course he is now an acting ensign, I'm pretty sure they would get thrown out, or at the very least disciplined. And what's worse is the scene where he goes, "Adults, I just happened to glance at your scans and noticed that these signals coming from the ship are exactly the same as Captain Picard's brain scans. I know none of you would have noticed that, because you're all clearly idiots. That's why Chief Engineer Argyle got the sack. Huh. Adults. Ugh. Horrible character moment. Nobody's going to like him for that.
Yeah, that's quite an embarrassing moment, to be honest. It feels as if they've never really known what to do with the character of Wesley. So we often end up with either awkward Wesley or annoying, precocious Wesley. And this one definitely falls into that latter camp.
Well, the next episode is a really good episode, but there's a Wesley moment in it, which is probably the worst Wesley moment in the history of the show.
Let's talk a little bit about the production design. The spheres, the mind control spheres, they look pretty naff, don't they? They remind me of the little balls out of Terrahawks.
Yeah, they were awful. In fact, they were just terrible. One of the worst pieces of prop making we've had so far.
I don't think it looked terrible. It was just the fact that it was gigantic.
That's what I mean. They are totally unfit for purpose.
And they glowed red. Now, Worf, when moving this crate from Picard's quarters, which was open when he left, failed to notice this giant red electric ball.
Is that a result of the previous episode after he was electrocuted in Lonely Among Us? That he now has big red electric balls?
That is why Klingons cannot go with human females. Also, I suppose notably, we've got the bridge of another Starfleet vessel on show. What did you think of that?
Where's that from?
That's the battle bridge that you might remember from Encounter at Farpoint.
Oh, right, okay. Oh, right, yeah. Well, there's cost saving for you.
They've changed the stations, and the turbo lift shaft is actually from the movie era Enterprise. There's a few things there, but primarily it is a redress of the battle bridge.
Okay. Because looking at it, I thought, well, I doubt very much that they've built a new set, so it's obviously cannibalised from somewhere. And I wasn't sure if it was the TV series or the films, but yeah, okay, that makes sense.
I've only just noticed a continuity error. When Picard is having the flashbacks, all of the people around him are wearing the current uniforms when they should be wearing the movie uniforms.
Yeah, I noticed that as well, so I've come prepared. Now, the Stargazer is not Picard's last command. It was lost in 2355. Now, Jack Crusher was killed in a mission the year previous to that. We're currently in 2364, for anyone who didn't know that, but I'm sure you all did. Now, we do see Jack Crusher later on, and he is wearing the modified movie-style uniform. But that holo recording... Hey, hang on. The holodecks are meant to be brand new. That holo recording was made when Wesley was born, so he could play it on his 18th birthday. He was planning on making a series of recordings. So it is perfectly conceivable that these uniforms are correct, but actually for a bit of texture, it would have been nice to see some different ones.
I did like the effects on the flashback. I thought that they were really well done.
Yeah, to have the sort of the fuzzy image. I imagine that must have been a nightmare to do.
And speaking of effects, I did quite like the transporter effect for the Ferengis with its swirliness. I quite liked that. That reminded me of the ones in the new Star Trek movie.
Speaking of the Ferengi, I think it's just worth saying for a moment that it's interesting the way it plays out in this episode, because in the previous episode they're sort of very much a one-dimensional type of villain, whereas in this you have one who's very extreme, and we know how that plays out. But then with the first officer character, you get the inner conflict between them and the idea that some are worse than others. You're actually getting an idea of characters rather than just a generic idea for a race, which is much better.
And they're not even the villains. The other Ferengi aren't villains, because at the end they say the other guy, there was no profit in it, so... Bok is no longer Daemon, so they think, okay, we don't care about you anymore, let's go. They're not even bad guys, they're not the villains, there's there's more to them.
Yeah, it is a pretty classic revenge tale in many ways, combined, as you've said, with the Trojan horse elements of it. Now, the one element of the plot I thought was incredibly unnecessary and didn't work was Riker finding Picard's personal logs, which state he fired upon the Ferengi unprovoked. It was just such a small element. If that had been the thrust of the episode, I could have understood it, but it was introduced and then resolved within a very short space of time and didn't really seem worth bothering about.
Well, I guess it sets up the idea that the Ferengi have a motive here, even though obviously they have a motive, but it adds to that.
I tell you what, we talked a couple of episodes ago about how the whole thing with Data doing his Sherlock Holmes routine seemed out of place there because we knew what the outcome was. It would have made more sense to have it here, to have them discover those recordings, those faked recordings, and have Data trying to discover what was going on there.
Yeah, because essentially within 5 minutes, Data's come back and said, yep, this log's faked. And there is no real sense of discovery. There's no CSI comparing of voice waves on a computer screen. It just pretty much is one scene where we discover them, and then the next scene, Data just says, well, this is the case. We've not really seen any of the evidence for ourselves. We're just taking Data's word. And why not? You know, he's fairly infallible. But it's poor scripting, I would say. So if we move on to the resolution of the episode, Picard is under the influence of the alien technology, and Riker manages to get a message through to him. And that's to fire a phaser at this alien device they know nothing about in a confined space. Does that seem like the best solution to everyone there?
No, perhaps not. Although, did they know how much of an explosion it was going to generate? Maybe not. But it's just an excuse to have a big bang at the end of the episode. And, you know, after last week seemed to be building to a big bang of a different variety, and we never got it, this week we do. We've mentioned Red Dwarf comparisons before. I just want to point out that this is very much like the end of Back to Reality.
Which again, this would have aired in the UK maybe about 1990.
I mean, it's there's lots of cases where I think it's probably just coincidence, and I think this is probably one of those. But you do watch through and you go, oh, there's a lot of parallels. Because there's an obvious influence of Star Trek on Red Dwarf.
That there is, and all that rambling leads us to our quickfire round.
Quickfire.
The Picard maneuver. That doesn't really work that well, does it? The idea that there's two at once...
It's all to do with light speed and our limited perceptions. If an object is far away, it takes longer for the light to travel towards us. So if that object then moves faster than the speed of light, very briefly, it will simultaneously appear in two places at once, while the light, which is further away, waits to catch up with the movement in the ship. It's very clever.
They did actually use the Picard maneuver on set to describe when they'd pull down their outfits because they'd ride up.
The warp effect that they use is actually the one from the movies on the Stargazer, as opposed to the one that stretches, which is used in the Next Generation onwards.
The Stargazer was a nice model.
Well, interesting that you should say that, because the Stargazer was originally supposed to be a Constitution-class starship, just like the original Enterprise, but it was decided that they wanted to go down another route. If you watch closely, you can see both Geordi and Wesley's lines have been overdubbed with Constellation when they were in fact saying Constitution. The bridge of the Stargazer, I liked that the consoles have labels on them. Helm says helm and navigation says nav. Dr. Crusher calls Riker number one, which is weird. He's not her number one. And also Riker says make it so, which I suppose shows the influence Picard is having upon him.
No, she just means that he's her number one. She's got a little list.
Well, that wraps up another week of First Contact. Thank you very much for joining us. If you'd like to email us, why not do that at firstcontact@thespoilist.com, or you could go and find our blog where you can find all the details on how to subscribe by RSS or iTunes. That's thespoilist.com. Next time we will be looking at a Roddenberry episode. That's Hyde and Q. We hope you'll join us for that. But for now, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.